All right, so in this video, we're going to look at indexing pandas objects. All right, so I'm just going to run these first two cells, which are importing pandas, and then reading in that store cells forecasting CSV. And remember, we've got that encoding. We've got to use Latin 1. All right, so I'm going to use the head method here to look at the first 5 rows. So if you recall, pandas, in this case, we're dealing with a pandas data frame. We've got alternating row colors, we've got index and column labels. So we are dealing with a pandas data frame object, right? So let's look at indexing, right? So there's a few ways that you can do indexing, but the most common way and the one that I would kind of advise you to stick with, because I think, again, from a readability perspective, this one's going to be advantageous. Let me just use this head. Let's just do 2 rows. There we go. What I would advise you to use is the loc accessor. All right. So I'm actually going to show you, I'll show you loc and the counterpart to loc, which is called iloc. But what loc allows you to do, and that's just, you've got, in this case, I've got a pandas data frame, and I can do a .loc, and that is going to be that loc accessor. And what I can do is I can specify specific index or column values, or both, to get data, specific pieces of data back from this data frame. All right, so in particular, what if I wanted to get this row right here? Right, so, okay, well, I want to grab that row. I want to grab all columns, and for that row, which is corresponding to index 1 in that data frame. So what's the index value? So if I wanted to grab that row, I could do a .loc 1. So give me back all of the data in index position 1. And when I do this, note that it returns to me a pandas series, right? So we've got, here's our, in this case, what it's done is taken all of that data. It's giving me back these column labels. It's saying, well, here's a, all of the data in that row. Here is the data that was in the row ID column, that was 2. And the order ID, that was CA 2016 152156. But this is a series where that series is essentially showing, it's giving me an index which corresponds to the columns in the original data. And then here's the values that took on. All right, so again, just a panda series, right? So it's returning that series, that data from that row, as a pandas series. All right. Now you might say, well, we did that to grab the values for a particular index position, so a row label. Can we do the same thing for columns? So what if I wanted to get this customer ID column? Can we then do a data.loc? And then let me make sure I've got the name correct. So that's going to be customer ID with a space. So we'll say customer ID. That's going to give me an error. All right, so one thing that you should note when you're using loc is if you're trying to get a column, you have to specify rows first. So if we just give it a single value, it's assuming that is in the index of the data frame. Okay, so it's only going to look in the index. If I want to get the rows, or the column, or a particular column, I should say, what we need to do is say, well, do this across all rows, okay, and then give me that customer ID column, right? So in this case, it is returning customer ID. If I were to go up and look at my head, so we can see CG12520 is in the first 2 entries in that series, and then SO20335. And we see, again, CG12. So it's just grabbing those out. All right. So this is how you can grab an entire column. And then if you want to grab a row, you can specify that with a row index. All right. And recall, I showed this briefly. I'm going to show this now. If you don't want to do a .loc to get the column, Pandas also allows you just to specify something like this. So a customer ID. That will also allow you to grab that column back as a series. And you can see that those two are equivalent. All right. So if we're thinking about loc, right, I'm just going to copy this back down, or actually I'm just going to delete that example there. All right, so this first position is kind of showing us our, our index values, and then we've got a comma, and then we can specify our column labels. This looks very similar to like a NumPy type of slicing, right? So if you remember NumPy, we kind of had these, if we had a multi-dimensional array, and I have a playlist up on NumPy if you want to go back and watch that as a refresher. If we had a multi-dimensional array, let's say a two-dimensional array, well, NumPy thought of those things as axes, right? And if we wanted to slice that, let's just do that as an example. So if I were to bring in NumPy as MP, and let's just make a simple myArray object, and I'll do a NumPy array, and I'm going to actually bring that back out. All right, so the first row, let's just put 1, 2, 3, and then comma, something is off here. There we go. And then 4, 5, 6. All right, so right now I've got a NumPy array. So if I were to do the type of my array, right, we've got a NumPy array. And let's say that I wanted to get this 2 and 5, right? I wanted to grab essentially, what is almost, you can think about in kind of a two-dimensional structure, right? If this is a matrix, what if I want to grab that 2 and 5? Well, it's almost like that, a second column. Well, we could have said, well, give me, essentially all the values in axis 0. And then for axis position 1, so 0, 1, I want to grab that column. So that gives me back that 2, 5. Right? So that's very similar to kind of how loc is working, right? So you've got to specify this axis 0 in NumPy speak, and then in Pandas speak, it's kind of like the index is kind of corresponding to that. And that's one thing that you should know, because again, Pandas is just built on top of NumPy. That's why they look so similar, because really it's implemented these things as NumPy arrays under the hood. So in Pandas, a lot of their methods, you will actually see they make reference to this notion of an axis, right? And you can specify axes just like you did in NumPy. So axis 0 would essentially be the rows of a data frame. Axis 1 would be the columns of a data frame. All right, so that's kind of where that is coming from. All right, what if I wanted to grab a specific value? So let's do data.head. All right, and what if I wanted to grab, let's see, this value right here. So this ship date value in index position 2. So that 10/18/2015. Well, we can use a loc, right? So to grab that value right there, right, index position 2, column ship date, we would do a data.loc. All right, index position 2, column ship date, and that grabs that value. Right, so, and again, so, this is similar to NumPy. It's also somewhat similar to the way that you access data in Excel. So, you usually would do like a equals A3 or something like that. So row column. So, it's somewhat similar in that respect. All right, I am going to mention the other option for accessing. So instead of loc, we also have a thing called iloc. All right. Now watch what happens. Remember earlier when we did data.loc and we put 1, we got the value from index position 1 right here. All right. Well, now when I do a data.iloc and I put 1, it looks pretty much the same. So just to show you, so when I do data.loc 1, right? So we got CA 2016-152-156, and we got the same thing here. So these things look pretty much equivalent, and in fact, they are grabbing exactly the same data. All right. So this is where things might get subtly confusing, is because when Pandas reads in a data frame, it automatically creates an index, right? So when I read this data frame in, it automatically created this index starting at 0, 1, 2. So if you don't specify a column to use as the index, it's gonna just automatically create one for you, right? So it starts at 0 and it goes to 1. And in this case, they grab the same thing if I'm using loc or iloc. Well, where does this break down? Well, let's say that we wanted to grab this ship date column. If we were using .loc, we would say, okay, well, we want to do a dot loc, give me all of the rows, and then give me ship date. Right, that works. But what if we did that with iloc? Now we get a problem, right? It says, hey, location-based indexing can only have integer, integer slice, list like of integers, Boolean. So it seems like it's a little bit of an ambiguous, especially if you're new to pandas. This could be a little bit of a confusing error message, right? Because it's like, oh, okay, well, when I'm just grabbing a row, it looked like it worked, but now I try to grab a column and it didn't. And the key thing to note is the difference between loc and iloc is the iloc is actually based off of position, which is kind of hinted at in this error right here. So it's a location-based index or a position-based index. So let's just look at data.head2 one more time here. So ship mode, what column is it if we were thinking about it from a location perspective? Well, this would be the column in index position 0, and this weird, right? So I'm being really careful here. So if we were to think about this as an array, so that's probably the better way to think about this. So imagine that your column labels, what if you had those as an array and you wanted to grab ship mode? Well, if it was an array, well, you wouldn't want row ID, so that would be an index position 0 of the array of column names. Order ID would be an index 1, 2, 3, 4. You're wanting to grab the fourth object in that array of column names. So what is actually the way that you access that column using iloc is you have to specify the position. Right, so that's the difference, right? So when you're using iloc, you've got to use integers, and they're corresponding to positions on either the index or the columns. If you're using loc, you can use the index labels and the column labels, okay? The reason that when we did, data iloc 1, the reason that worked is because the label for that index is 1, right? So if I do loc 1, well, it's looking up, hey, where is 1 in the index? When I do iloc, it's saying, okay, I'm not looking for a 1, but represent this index as an array and give me the thing in index position 1. So a little bit of a subtle difference there. All right. Again, what I would encourage you to do as much as possible is to just use loc, right? Because you're specifying the label. So to me, it's more explicit, right? So if I look at this, right? So if I want to grab, that entry in ship mode, I'm sorry, that should have been iloc. So I'm essentially grabbing from, the index position 1 in the array of indexes of the index, and then or index labels, and then index position 4 in the array of column labels. Well, I'm grabbing this ship date, right? But if you have this in your code, again, to future you, it's going to be ambiguous, right? Because you need to know, okay, well, you've got to think, well, what's in index position 4 of the column labels, right? Whereas if you were to just use a loc, right, now we can specify that column name. To me, that's much more explicit. All right. All right, so that's, using loc and iloc, and that's the difference between those. And I did want to show you, like in NumPy, again, you can do really kind of fancy indexing. You can do the same thing with loc, right? So what if we wanted to select, a few different rows? So I'm going to make an object called rows to select, and let's just say rows, index positions or index labels 2, 4, and 6. And then we could do columns to select. And that could be maybe category. I think we've got a category. Let's just do segment and country, since I know that's in there. Segment and country. All right. And now I can use data.loc, because these are going to correspond to labels in the index and the column. So I can use a data.loc. And then I can say, well, for the rows, use the rows to select. And then for the columns, use the columns to select. All right. And notice in this case, it's returning a data frame, right? So in this case, this object is a data frame that comes back. Why is that a data frame? Well, we've got multiple columns, right? So it's selecting multiple columns coming back. So it's got to represent that in that two-dimensional structure. Let's see what would happen if we only did one column. Imagine it's going to return a data frame as well. Right, so this is actually a data frame because, again, we've got the alternating row colors and you've got both index and column labels, right? So you kind of got to play around. Always think about, trying to keep track of, what is being returned, okay? Another thing that I wanted to show you real quick as far as indexing is that, you can actually filter these data frames pretty efficiently using Boolean filtering, which is another thing that we saw in NumPy. So let's just look again at NumPy. So if you recall, with NumPy, if I import that as NP, and let's say I have an array, my array, and let's just say that's going to be a NumPy array with values 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, and 1. All right, so I've got my array, and we could do things like this. I could say, well, give me, are these values greater than or equal to 3? And it will return to me a NumPy object, a NumPy array of Booleans, right? So it's saying, hey, well, for, the value in index position 0 here, that 4, that's true. It satisfies that condition. For the 5 here, that's true. It's not true for the 2. Right? So it returns an array that's the same shape as the original object, and it contains trues and falses based on whether or not it satisfies that condition. All right. Well, remember, I've said it a couple of times, Pandas is just built on top of NumPy, right? So it is just, there are a bunch of NumPy arrays essentially is what makes up a data frame. So let's look at our data again. All right, and notice in our ship mode, we've got second class, standard class. What if we want to get all of the data where the ship mode is equal to standard class, right? So I don't want these first two rows, right? Maybe I'm interested in taking a deep dive into, what are the characteristics of individuals that order standard class. All right, well, what we can actually do, right, is let me grab a column. So in this case, I'm going to grab, and again, we could have done this with .loc, right? I could say, give me all rows and give me back my ship mode column values. All right. Or I could have just abbreviated this instead of doing that .loc. If you're getting a column, you can do it that way. All right. Well, what if I say, now make a comparison, right? So use some type of a conditional operator and say, well, give me back all of these where that is equal to standard class. All right, notice that it's giving me back an object of Booleans, right? So what's the object type? Well, this turns out it's a Pandas series, right? So if I were to look at the type, whoops. All right, it's a series, okay? And interestingly, notice that, okay, in that series, so it's saying, okay, well, does the value in index 0 for index label 0 match that condition, right? And if we look back at our data, again, I'm just going to pull that up, do the head 3, maybe. All right, well, for index label 0, if I look in ship mode, that's second class. That's not standard class. So that should be false. Same thing for index label 1. But index label 2 should be true. And that's in fact what we see. But we've got the index labels right here. So it's saying for index label 0, that's false. For index label 1, that's false. For index label 2, that's true. So what we can actually do is we can use this series in a .loc accessor to just get back the things we care about. Okay. So let's say that this is going to be my standard class filter. All right, that's interesting, but how does this work? It looks really odd because I'm essentially assigning to a variable this thing over here and it's got a comparison. But the key thing, the reason I can do this is because when I run this, I know it returns a series. Okay, so what I'm going to say is to the left of this, we'll take that series that's returned and store it in standard class filter. All right, so it does that, and now I can do a data.loc. And for the rows, I want you to use the labels, the index labels that match true in that filter, and then give me all the columns. All right, so all of these are our standard class. So notice that those first two rows of our data frame are not there anymore, right? Okay, so you can do it like this. You can also, they allow this shorthand. Again, if you want to be consistent, because the one thing that is true about pandas and some of these libraries, there's a few different ways that you could do it. So I always tell people, if that kind of bothers you, if you don't like the fact that, you know, there's a couple different ways, just learn one way and always use that. So doing this .loc, this is always going to work, right? Give me all the columns and do it where the rows match this, right? So I'm going to show you another way that will work, but you know what? It's perfectly fine to do this, right? Every time. If it's easier for you to say, you know what? If I need to do this thing, this is the way that I've remembered how to do this thing. So Pandas also allows you to just say data and then do that standard class filter. That also works. All right, so again, those rows are gone. Now, at this point, this will be a great opportunity for me to, again, revisit loc and iloc, just to, again, really make sure that everybody is very comfortable with those differences. All right, so notice now we've filtered our data, so we don't have all that we originally had, right? So I don't have index labels 0 and 1 anymore because they weren't standard class, right? So now, since this is returning a data frame, right? So note that this is a data frame that we're looking for. That returns a data frame. So since that's a data frame and loc is a data frame method, I can just pop loc on the end of it. If I want to get index label 2, there it goes. If I try to get index label 0, it gives me an error. Why does it give me an error? Because remember, .loc is looking for a label in the index that matches what we're providing. If I look with our standard class filter, we no longer have an index label 0. It's not there, right? Because they weren't using standard class as a ship mode. So when I do a .loc and it checks for that, it's failing. All right. If I were to do an iloc, that will work. And notice it's returning row ID 4. Well, which data point is that? That's this first one here that corresponds to index label 2. But remember, iloc is just positional only. So it's just saying, okay, we'll take all of these labels in the index as an array and just give me the label that's in index position 0. So again, that hopefully kind of clarifies those differences. All right, so that is indexing, or at least some basics of indexing in Pandas. Again, it works very, very similar to NumPy. We've got both loc and iloc. So loc is based off of the labels of the index and the columns. Iloc is just the position. And you can also use Boolean filtering to come up with series to help you filter down a data frame like we did with our standard class filter. And we also saw that you can do kind of this fancy filtering, right? So I can specify multiple rows, different types of columns, and I can just pass that to .loc, and it will work as well. All right, so that will conclude this video.